Hi, it's Alaska Granny. Putting away food storage for long-term emergencies is such a smart thing to do. We've seen there's a lot of unrest in our country at this time, aside from a lot of natural disasters, and having enough food on hand makes sure whether there's a pandemic, earthquake, forest fire, whatever it could be, you're going to be able to feed your family. When you have a stockpile of food, you don't need to go to the store. You can shop the food in your own pantry and in your stockpile. Oxygen absorbers are a great way to help seal up your food for long-term food storage. Oxygen absorbers remove the oxygen from the container where you've stored your food. We want to preserve the qualities of the foods we buy and prevent the oxygen, insects, and even moisture from destroying or harming or damaging our food. We don't want to go get food out of our pantry and find out that it's deteriorated, it's no longer good or safe to eat. When you want to use an oxygen absorber, we know that they come sealed up in a pack, and when you open these, you need to immediately be ready to use them and store any extras into a clean canning jar with a tight-fitting lid, because they will begin to work immediately, and any that are not placed inside an airtight container will be wasted because they will absorb all the oxygen that's just around you normally in your home. Before you even begin to open your oxygen absorbers, make sure you have a clean canning jar to store any extras, or have something like an iron or a flat iron that you can reseal the package that it came in. You can have this preheated before you open this, take out the ones you need, and then seal the package back. Oxygen absorbers are a great way to store dried foods that are naturally dry in content, like beans, rice, oatmeal, pasta, lentils, split peas, foods that are naturally dry. There are a lot of foods that are just not safe to store with an oxygen absorber, and I'm going to tell you what some of those foods are and why you shouldn't use them. There are a host of foods that seem like they're dry, but they're not dry completely. They're not dry enough to remove the oxygen, and what happens is you risk allowing botulism to grow into your airtight container. Botulism only grows in a container where there is no oxygen. You can't see it, you can't smell it, you can't taste it, and it is lethal and can kill you. So you don't want to mess around with your food storage. These are foods you can store in airtight containers, but never use them with an oxygen absorber. The first one is brown rice. Brown rice has a lot of oil in it, and it doesn't last for long term. A better choice is to choose white rice. Jerky is another food you should never use an oxygen absorber. You may find little packets in jerky, but that's not for oxygen. That's usually for moisture control, like a silica pack, like you might find when you buy a pair of shoes. Jerky's not dry like beans and rice, so don't use an oxygen absorber with that. Granola is another food you should never use an oxygen absorber. I like to make my own granola in the crock pot. I'll put a link to a video of how I make it, and then I store it in clean canning jars, but I don't use an oxygen absorber. Just storing it in a clean canning jar, it can last about 2 years in my pantry. Dried eggs are also not safe to use an oxygen absorber. Dried eggs that you would buy from something like August Farms that come in a number 10 can are commercially freeze-dried. So that's a different story than trying to dry and dehydrate your own eggs. Brown sugar should not have an oxygen absorber. That can turn it into a brick right inside your jar. Never use an oxygen absorber with dried fruits and vegetables like prunes, plums, raisins, apricots, cranberries, and even other foods like these dried mushrooms. These are not dried enough to be considered like freeze-dried or dehydrated to the point of they're crisp and they would snap and break when you bend them. Anytime they're still flexible, do not use them with an oxygen absorber. Baking powder, baking soda, no oxygen absorbers. They can actually explode. No oxygen absorber for nuts. Don't use an oxygen absorber with powdery foods like sugar, salt. When you open the number 10 cans of long-term food storage, for example, the ones from August Farms, once you open them, there's about a year of shelf life left on the contents. And yes, you can take the extras and put them into an empty, clean canning jar and put on the lid. But don't add an oxygen absorber if it's a powdered food like tomato powder. The oxygen absorber can turn it hard, and then it's a big brick inside your bottle, and your product isn't going to be very useful. I bought this pack of 100 oxygen absorbers from the LDS or the Mormon Church online. It was less than $10, and I paid $3 shipping to have 100 of the oxygen absorbers mailed to my home. These are 300 cc's. How many cc's of oxygen absorber do you use when you're sealing your food? If you're storing a quart jar, you need 100. Gallon jars require 400 cc's. 5-gallon buckets need 2,000 cc's. And the Mylar bags are going to need according to the size of your bag. You can buy oxygen absorbers online at Amazon that I think are 100 cc's. The only size that the Mormon Church sells is 300. It's perfectly safe to add a larger oxygen absorber to your container, but make sure that you have enough. So pay attention to whatever container or package you're using, that you have enough oxygen absorber to seal up the bucket, jar, or Mylar pouch that you're using. When you do use an oxygen absorber, make sure it's foods that are already dry and that you're ready to go. Here's a jar of macaroni. I have my oxygen absorber. I can stick it right down in, nestle it in, and quickly put on the lid and the ring. And then the oxygen absorber is going to suck out all of the oxygen in the jar. It can take a couple hours for it to work, and you'll know it's complete when the top is sealed. This one's not sealed. You can hear there's still air in it, just like when you can things in your pressure canner or in your water bath. They don't seal unless this sucks down. But this just went in, and so after a few hours, that's going to be sucked in, and I'll know that it's sealed completely. If you're going to be using the food within a year, save your oxygen absorbers for foods that you plan to store longer term. Sometimes it's hard to find oxygen absorbers, and it's also an added expense where it may not be necessary for the foods that you're going to be rotating. If you do want to open and use the food that's been sealed with an oxygen absorber, you just need to open the can, pry off the lid carefully, maybe with the side of a spoon. Then if you wanted to reseal your container, you would need to use a new oxygen absorber because that one has already been used up. If you only use part of the food, you can add another oxygen absorber and seal it up. If you wanted to open up a Mylar bag and use some of that food, open it very carefully along the seam, pour out the food you want, add a new oxygen absorber, squeeze out extra air, and then seal it up again with your flat iron. Make sure you have your iron hot before you open your oxygen absorber so you don't waste any of the suction power of it waiting for your iron to heat up. Oxygen absorbers are wonderful for food storage, but they're not appropriate for all types of foods. So keep in mind which foods you should never use an oxygen absorber, and feel free to use them on all kinds of other foods to help your foods last the longest. If you liked my video, I hope you'll share it with someone else who might enjoy it. Learn more at alaskagranny.com, and please subscribe to the Alaska Granny channel.